In the late 1960s, a wave of German bands and musicians emerged intent on creating new sounds and exploring new technologies.
As an artist, you have to create something new, your own way. You have to create your own art.
We were pretty much aware that we weren't raised in the Mississippi Delta, or we weren't raised in Liverpool. Our generation had to come up with a counterpoint to that. If you want to come up with a new sound, you want to touch new ground, you have to use new material, or at least change your perspective. Using machines open up another door for this new quality.
So many musicians, so many bands, so many influences, this just can happen once, I think, yeah. It was the Blütezeit, the blooming, yeah, of German music at its peak.
This film not only explores the various artists of this experimental movement, but also focuses on the group whose music would influence so much of modern electronica, Kraftwerk.
Obviously, the aesthetic investment was into something completely different from what all the other bands were into. All the other bands were into with the most different means, but they were all into experience. And Kraftwerk was not that. It was obviously about distance to music. There was something conceptual, there was something humorous, there was irony.
The difference between Kraftwerk and the other bands wish to totally disassociate themselves from the past and the Germans' history. Kraftwerk were different. They were willing to embrace the past. In so doing, they actually, in the long term, they invented a new kind of aesthetic that people around the world could really relate to by using humor and experiment and brilliant understanding of electronic sound. They basically remade German identity and made it something to actually look at.
The Second World War left Germany in ruins. Over 9 million German soldiers and civilians dead, numerous cities destroyed, and the country split into zones occupied by both the Allied and Soviet military. By 1949, the country was divided into a Soviet East and a capitalist West Germany. And where the East was a socialist state, the West adopted a social market economy that by the 1950s would see the country enjoy a steady period of growth. Despite this economic stability, the youth of the country were born into a ruptured world in which their elders were viewed with suspicion and in which a guilt over the very fact of being a German was widespread. And so by the late 1950s, this new generation began to embrace the youth culture of their Allied occupiers.
Den alten Strukturen im Lande, das heißt mit einer Generation, die zu der Zeit, also in den 60ern, noch überall die entscheidenden Positionen innehatte, nicht nur an den Spitzen der Gesellschaft, also als Unternehmer, Politiker, sondern auch im ganzen Mittelbau als Lehrer, Professoren, Richter, Staatsanwälte. Überall saß noch die Generation, die den Nationalsozialismus mitgemacht hatte und zu einem nicht unerheblichen Prozentsatz auch mitgewollt hatte. Für junge Arbeiter war aber die neue Zeit, die da kam, mit all ihren Verheißungen in Form von persönlicher Freiheit, Konsum. Es war eine sehr wirtschaftlich prosperierende Zeit, ein großes Versprechen. Also das Vorbild dabei war Amerika. Und wer immer dann als junger Mensch in den 60ern mit diesen alten Strukturen, diesem Autoritarismus, der einen von ersten Tag an zur Unterwürfigkeit erzog, zum Untertanen und, wenn nötig, zum guten Soldaten oder zum guten Arbeiter, je nachdem, wie die Zeiten waren. Wer da dagegen war, für den war diese Musik, die aus den USA kam und aus England, einfach die Verheißung, dass es ein anderes Leben geben könne.
And Germany would play a pivotal part in the early history of Western popular music. A number of clubs began to appear in the major cities, and with UK bands more adept at imitating American acts than the Germans, soon these clubs were full of British rock and roll groups. At the centre of this was Hamburg, a major port with a large entertainment district. Here, young rock bands played to an audience of both German teenagers and Allied Navy crews, and it was here that the Beatles learnt their craft. Yet the German groups who began to emerge were often simply imitating those British beat bands, and this scene would have little in common with the movement that would eventually emerge.
In terms of music, pop music, there was not much. There was, of course, the Hamburg world, which was shaped by, which was a vibrant music scene, and one that also would cross over to other arts, but that was based mainly on traveling British and American bands like the Beatles and others famously, but also like regulars were like bands like Ian and the Zodiacs or something like that, who were but then doing things like accompanying poetry readings by very advanced poets. So, but that's right, there were basically no Germans doing anything interesting musically, with the exception of free jazz. Free jazz in Germany, I would go to the legacy of people like Peter Brötzmann, who was involved with the Fluxus movement in the early 60s, and others. There was a free jazz movement in Berlin happening around people like Alexander von Schlippenbach, Sven Åke Johansson, who came from Sweden. And this was, of course, a completely unique musical movement, and it was based on scenes in German cities. And out of the Berlin free jazz movement, for example, you had certain bands coming out who were close to the later electronic scene. Like Sven Åke Johansson had this band, Moderne Europäische Dorfmusik, modern European village music, which was kind of a electronic avant-garde rock free jazz mixture. They recorded in the late 60s, I think 2 albums, and they played at the same places where early Tangerine Dream played.
And it was out of this new rock and jazz culture that German variations of the Anglo-American musical model began to take shape. By 1967, the German counterculture was emerging, with students demonstrating and communes being formed. With political tensions heightened by the death of student Benno Ohnesorg, Berlin in particular was a center for unrest. And at the same time as this youth movement was growing, new music from America was influencing the bands of this scene.
In '67, it was for the Berlin scene, there was an ignition when the Mothers of Invention came to play. That was an interesting concert because, all the students, the SDS went there, the pupils, all the political scene went there. Well, it was about 10,000 people, and I think most of the scene was there. And people had waited for a band like this to come to Berlin. So it was like a swing from the nice Jerry and the Pacemakers and Equals and pop groups from Great Britain to flower power hippie thing. And I think these are also the influences which helped the German musicians develop their own style.
But while much of the German musical scene was simply intent on now mimicking a new kind of American music, experimental musicians began to emerge who would shape a unique sound. Konrad Schnitzler, who had studied sculpture under radical German artist Joseph Beuys in Düsseldorf, was central to this new movement. Having relocated to Berlin in the mid-60s, he was a trained artist and not a musician, but he began working with colleagues Hans Achim Rodelius and Boris Schack on a new form of experimental music that would eventually embrace electronics.
My dream was always to make sounds and music, but I couldn't because I was not a musician and never learned. And there were, also before, there were all these young people making this kind of hippie music with a drum and flute and all this, and I was hating this. Anyway, I was never liking melodies because a melody is like a worm in your head. You hear this melody and the whole day it rattles in your head. I didn't want it. I want to have something what goes in and you lost it already. And Boris and Achim, they said, oh no, not this. I have other idea about making music. Only if you can play an instrument, you can make free sounds. And I want to have, let's say, noise sounds composed together in a way what is interesting. You know? Like if the steam hammer goes here and the bird pipes there and a car comes and the airplane goes over, if you are the director of it, then you say, hey, stop, moment, don't come now, you know, now all together or whatever, you know. This is the only philosophy I want, and the philosophy behind is, as an artist, you have to create something new.
At the real beginning, I just wanted to try what's going on when I use a flute or my voice or drums. How do I react on what I'm doing with any sort of instrument or any sort of noise? So it was not music at all that influenced me, or not any style, or not any trend. I just was so curious to work with noise and sounds and tones, to become aware what's that, what's music, what has it, what's the ground in it, how should it be?
And needing a rehearsal and performance space, Schnitzler and Rodelius began to rent part of a theatre. This room eventually became the Zodiac Free Arts Lab.
We had this room, and we made a lot of, Boris and Achim, they bought some new instruments, you know, for no caching, for caching later, you know, because it was all so really fantastic. Yeah, we played there 2-3 days, nobody came. Of course not, we made no advertising for nothing. Nobody knows us, nobody knew what was going on there. So and the first, our group was called Geräusche, means noises, you know. And I had the small, tiny papers, and with a stamp, and 100 of these papers we stamped, and we give them as flying papers around, and where was if there was somewhere a concert of modern music, like in the area of the television station, is it now? Yes, radio SFB, and the people came out and give them the paper. Or there was Emerson, Lake and Palmer somewhere playing. We put these papers around, and it was really dark also there, and you saw the papers flying. And so afterwards, there was coming people. And then we invite also other musicians, groups, but not normal groups. Sometimes they want somebody plays who just played music from other groups, you know. We didn't want it, we want something what was experimental. And so there came like Schulze with his group came, and of course Edgar came back, and I was with Edgar already in a connection, you know, and he came with his group, and so we had, it was full of equipment, everything, you know. We didn't remove this. It was forever there, and only the groups who was then on the end have the right to play there every evening. What means after the theater was to the end, because otherwise it was too loud, you know.
And the Zodiac became a hive of activity. Where rock had previously been the typical music emerging from the city, now an underground began to form that would draw the most daring musicians to it.
Rockmusik konnte in Berlin nicht so florieren. Rockbands lösten sich relativ schnell auf. Geld war nicht. Dann war diese Free-Jazz-Szene sehr einflussreich. Und am Anfang mischte sich das auch. Und zwar ausgerechnet in diesem Club, den Konrad aufgemacht hatte. Im Zodiac spielten Leute, die heute große Namen im improvisierten Jazz sind, wie Brötzmann, Irene Schmalzer, Schlippenbach. Manche Leute wechselten von einem Genre zum anderen, wie Uli Trepte, der im Trio mit Irene Schmalzer spielte, also Jazz, und dann zu Guru Guru ging, also einer richtigen Krautrock-Band. Diese Szene war da sehr, sehr durchlässig.
Everything was allowed, even smoking joints, so it was really free atmosphere. There were many projects, But the Zodiac was the first nucleus of where everybody came together. It was sort of nest. And out of the Zodiac, many, many different groups really became aware of themselves. Tangerine Dream, Klaus Schulze, all these guys, they studied themselves in the Zodiac.
I think in every city, it is like you're always looking in a room where you can make loud music, you know. And the Zodiac, it was under a big theater, and there was also a pub next to it, and there was a big room where the owner said, you know, here you can play there, you know. And then we just, yeah, we played a couple of bands like Cluster and Plus Minus was a big beginning where Schnitzler was also there, and there was Tangerine Dream there. Then I was with my band with Psy Free, but it was a nice kind of, let's say, kind of a factory for bands. So then we got, let's say, a bit known through that in Berlin. And then comes people from other clubs, and they said, can you play the same thing in my club or in our club? And so it started slowly, but we were really like totally underground, lowest underground, when you say like this, you know.
This experimentation was not only occurring in Berlin, however. In Munich, radical art commune Amon-Düül was established in '67, and it quickly developed a reputation for its musical performances. Like at the Zodiac, the emphasis was on free-form structures and improvisation, and the commune had a similar perspective on artistic freedom, valuing enthusiasm and attitude over technical ability. As they began to tour the country, it became clear that Amon-Düül were a very different proposition than the Anglo-American influenced pop bands.
Amon-Düül was this already this myth and legendary band when they existed. I mean, you had rumors all over Germany, because if they played somewhere, this was so different. They came with their children, they came with their wives, you never knew what the lineup is, yeah, if they play with 4 people or with 20. They always had fights on stage, behind stage, and this was nothing you really expected from a city like Munich. The first music clubs after the war, and in the 60s, even when already Amon-Düül started, have been American GI clubs where they played soul and black music. So in Munich you had a huge community of German musicians interpreting American soul. Yeah. So of course this was a really break Amon-Düül. That was really completely different.
For me, it was like now we were starting to build our own musical identity in Germany, taking influences from all parts and also German influences. Amon-Düül always had a strange affection to their Bavarian past, to the end that they released an album in '74, I think, where they posed in King Ludwig's habit and things like that, and sang about him and about the Bavarian past as a kingdom. So in the late '60s, it was an alternative scene because they mixed things and they did jazzy things. They did very daring things, if I may say so. They didn't just copy anymore. Until '67, it was let's try to do a nice beat band sound, let's try to copy the British bands.
The big magazines picked up on them because of the wildness, yeah, of the image. it was really something very interesting, exotic.
And this new innovative approach to music would spread through Germany. In the far west of the country, the Rhine-Ruhr area comprising cities Cologne and Düsseldorf, yet another scene began to emerge. Both cities had their fair share of beat bands and cover acts, but they also had thriving artistic scenes. In Cologne, Can formed, a group who would become one of the leading lights of the German movement. And in Düsseldorf, future Kraftwerk pioneers Ralf Hutter and Florian Schneider founded the organization.
When I think of Kraftwerk and our organization and the whole scene around them, the things that would come to my mind as forerunners would not be in the field of music, but in the field of fine art, visual art. I think the Düsseldorf scene at the 60s was a very vibrant scene based around this place, this club called Cream Cheese, which was very important, which was a nightclub, a discotheque, decorated and organized by people from the Zero movement, which was a kind of very important movement, and other artists around. The Düsseldorf Art Academy was there, where people like Joseph Beuys were teaching at that time, and this is far more for me the culturally important background.
Yet although there was a major influence from the world of the visual arts, there was also a more academic element to these bands. Unlike the various artists from the Zodiac scene or those in Amon-Düül, the organization's Florian Schneider and Ralf Hutter and Cannes' Holger Schukai and Ermin Schmidt were classically trained musicians. And classical music itself had been going through some radical changes since the 1930s, with various composers striving to introduce an electronic component into it. A major figure in the introduction of new sounds and electronic techniques in this area was Frenchman Pierre Schaeffer.
Pierre Schaeffer was imported in France because he had a studio in Radio France. Most of the early electronic studios were in radio stations in the late 1940s, mid 1950s, because they had the equipment. The equipment they were using was basically tone generators, oscillators, sine wave generators, very basic sound equipment that produced, that changed sound waves. And then they didn't have tape. Pierre Schaeffer's early experiments with music were discs from records. What he did was he actually got records, 78s of say train sounds, water sounds, crowd sounds, marching band sounds, and mixed them together and invented this thing called music concrete, or real music.
The main instrument that he used in the beginning was a record player, and then when he was given access to a tape recorder, it totally revolutionized the way he worked. And so he was one of the first people really to use technology within a musical system, as a really major part of the musical system. And obviously this influenced many students of his, such as Pierre Henry and people like that, and later on Stockhausen.
And it was this towering figure of experimental music operating out of the Rhine-Ruhr area itself who would become a pivotal influence on emerging electronic musicians. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, who had collaborated with Pierre Schaeffer in the early 1950s, developed a music that would not only incorporate concrete elements, but also pure electronics. The groundbreaking compositions that he created while working at the WDR Broadcasting Center's electronic studio in Cologne during the 1950s and 60s would dramatically change the shape of late 20th century music.
Stockhausen is by far the most important composer of the 20th century in regards to electronic music, because he invented the electronic music. I remember before Stockhausen there was no proper electronic music. People did not think about making just music electronically as a composition, writing it out, scoring it, then composing it in the studio, and then presenting it through loudspeakers. Nobody had the gall to do that before, but he did. And he would spend up to 6 months, maybe a year, putting together a half-an-hour piece or a 20-minute piece, either in Paris with Pierre Schaeffer or in Cologne, where he worked in the studio there. And Stockhausen had started to get a lot of people following him. And after 1956, when he did Gesang der Jugendliche, which is Song of the Youth, and that was a massive international sensation because it was basically loudspeakers on stage and him just playing a tape. There was no musicians. This was scandalous. This was ridiculous. The classicals at the time said this is crazy, but this really caused a huge uproar.
Die Leute waren mehr interessiert, meine ich, als heute. Also an dieser, sagen wir, ernsten elektronischen Musik. Heute sind die Leute schon interessiert an Techno und so weiter. Aber ich hatte schon das Gefühl, dass das Interesse an niemand weiß, dass es die gibt, die sogenannte ernste elektronische Musik, also experimentelle Musik und so weiter. Ja, also es gab zumindest, das war zwar oft eine ablehnende Haltung, aber es war bekannt, dass es das gibt. Stockhausen kannte man zum Beispiel in Deutschland, weil Stockhausen eben der Begriff.
And at the Robert Schumann Academy, where both Ralf Hutter and Florian Schneider were students, Stockhausen was a key part of the curriculum. Future Kraftwerk member Karl Bartos was also introduced to the composer's work while a student here.
I started my musical studies at the Robert Schumann Institute in Düsseldorf, and then I got acquainted to all the classical music. The idea about the electronic movement was that the composer, and I was a composer also in that time, a classical composer, as good as I could, the idea was bypassing the instrumentalist, bypassing the orchestra, and composing directly onto tape something. And the other movement at that time was the so-called musique concrète, coming from Pierre Schaeffer in Paris. And he was using found sounds, like sounds of the environment, sound of a tree, if you rattle it, or anything what made sound. And this is, it has always a lot to do with Kraftwerk, with the Kraftwerk sounds, this musique concrète and this electronic approach.
While this movement around Cologne and Düsseldorf was developing, in Berlin, one of the key bands from the Zodiac scene was preparing to record their first album. Edgar Froese, the founder and only constant member of Tangerine Dream, had been a prominent figure around West Berlin since the mid-60s. And although he had decided upon his group's name, the lineup was an ever-changing affair. For the debut release, Froese enlisted Klaus Schulze from the band Cy Free as his drummer, and Konrad Schnitzler was also asked to join a group that he had originally introduced to the Zodiac scene the previous year.
First they came because we asked them, coming back to us, because we need special groups or special persons to have public. And so they don't need me. But later on, when Edgar came and said, hey, play with me, then he has also already seen in the club what I has done, and so he was interested to have this noise to it instead of having a normal pop group. He was not always happy with this, what I did, you know. But on the end, he said, no, it's good, do it. Don't ask me, just do it, you know. And I was same loud like him. And Schulze sometimes had problems because at this time we had no in Schulze's drum, we had no mics. You know, he had not his own amp. He had no echoes on it. He just was drumming. He was like a locomotion, you know, like, wow. Just set him on his ass and then he was drumming, you know. I was young, just 18 or something like this. He had power over and over, you know.
Released in 1970, Electronic Meditation was a coarse yet significant work, the first artifact to emerge from the Zodiac scene and a sign of the experiments to come.
We didn't like the existing music at all, and we didn't want to copy English or American music. We want to do kind of, later on we would call it psychedelic music. It should be not nice, but it should be special. And that was the main thing, you know. Today, when I listen to it, if I dare to listen it, you know, it's rubbish. But it is important because we tried at least, you know, let's say as a takeoff. What comes out later on, nobody knew about this, you know. Tangerine now went this way, I still went this way, but to break through, you know, it was very important, the album, you know, and also very inspiring for other musicians, even if they don't do this, but at least they go another direction.
By the time of the album's release, however, the Zodiac Club was a distant memory, and the album's contributors had gone their separate ways. Where Froese continued to develop Tangerine Dream, Konrad Schnitzler had joined his original collaborator, Achim Rodelius, to form the group Cluster. Originally a two-piece, they recruited Zodiac Club regular Dieter Mobius as the third member of their experimental ensemble. Again, Schnitzler's philosophy dominated. Using conventional instruments filtered through various electronic devices, they would strive to create something both unfamiliar and esoteric.
I met Achim and Conny in a Kneipe, in a pub, and they were just asking me if I want to drum with them, and I said, okay, I'm the best drummer on earth. And next day I went to their place, and they showed me the stuff. They had everything for me ready to be played. And after 2 days, I think we had our first show in a gallery. We made a 12 hours non-stop show, and 2 days later we left Berlin forever in a big yellow post truck. And we tried to make our living with the music, which was in the beginning really very hard.
We went with a post bus from Berlin in '69 and stayed on the road for about 2 years, wandering from one city to another city, knocking at museum stores and saying, here we are, we want to do something, are you aware of us? No. So you will be aware if you let us play here. And it worked. In these years it worked. We just could survive, that was all. But we had big fun, it was great experience. We met a lot of people, and we made our audience by this way, just traveling from one city to another. From the north, from Oslo down to Ljubljana. Cluster was really lucky to be able to do this way, to work this way, even though we were very marginalized.
We were not able to be a normal rock band, of course. We couldn't play guitar riffs or real bass or play real drum. So we had to invent, if we want to realize that kind of music, we had to invent a new kind of music in a way. Or because we were not able to make music, we had to do what we did. Or we couldn't make music. Once we had the start of this kind of music we did, we couldn't stop anymore. We had to go on this way, and we wanted to go on this way. It was not really our philosophy to not make rock. It was our philosophy to work with what we had and what we could do with our hands, and of course, to get better in doing what we were doing. And this is working automatically in a way.
Cluster with a K made in what I would call early industrial music, in a way. They were very harsh. The sounds were very metallic. They were very ringing. There was the sounds of machinery, but there was also almost like the sound of industrial equipment being heaved in and out the studio. You know, if they were sort of dragging concrete mixers in, revving them up, you could kind of understand it, kind of like Einstürzende Neubauten or something, but obviously much earlier. And they were interested in noise, I think, more than anything else, the idea of noise and how to manipulate noise. And noise would, you know, be ignored for quite a long time, and, you know, has just really resurfaced over the past few years with the American noise scene, like Wolf Eyes and people like that, a whole load of bands that are involved in just creating complete noise. And then there's the Japanese noise scene with Merzbow. So they were sort of the precursors of this entire noise scene, in my opinion. When I hear Cluster with a K, I hear noise, and beautiful noise, you know, noises that are interesting, that have been, you know, just to say Schaefer would or Stockhausen would have been composed and put together as a piece of music.
As the Berlin bands were beginning to branch out and the growth of experimental German music started to appear more like a movement than a set of isolated individuals and collectives, Ralf Hutter and Florian Schneider's The Organization recorded their first and only LP, Tone Float. Behind the desk for the album was Conny Plank, a young producer and engineer who had recently completed work with Cluster on their debut Klopfzeichen, and who had set up his own company, Rainbow Productions, to record new German music. Tone Float was for both the organization and for Plank an experiment, a testing ground for new ideas.
Tone Float is an album that is completely different from, say, what happened with Kraftwerk eventually, mainly because it is more percussive based. There's a lot of percussion on it. Percussion, flute, and sort of a lot of warbling in a way. If it could be seen as a success, I don't know if it can be seen as a success. I think it's more of an experimentation, really. It's a way of them sort of like finding their own feet, really, in a way. You know, finding what they could do as this band, and trying to see where they could take it. At that point, electronics played very little part in their sound. It was mostly acoustical instruments, you know what I mean? So it sounds a bit like a sort of ethnic recording in a way, believe it or not, like a German ethnic recording. But you hear it today, and it is an extraordinary sort of example of early krautrock.
was Kraftwerk, there was the organisation, the album Tone Flow. Now, they're not really using synthesizers on the album. They're part of a sort of larger ensemble, as it were. But there are hints, first of all, in the very name, the organisation, with that kind of obviously very pointed formality, indicates the, you know, the kind of rather conceptual, schematic way in which they would intend to work. And, which is obviously very antithetical to the far more informal things you get with people like Amandul. So there was that, and also I think there's this strong emphasis on a kind of, there's a sort of strong sort of percussive, slightly minimal percussive line to it, which clearly would then sort of, as it were, snake through the rest of Kraftwerk's career.
The record was eventually taken by producer Connie Plank to Britain, where he managed to secure it a release through RCA. In Germany, however, the album was unavailable, and thus failed to get Hutter and Schneider any real success in their own country. Yet during 1970, the German scene significantly developed. With their commune having now divided into two separate musical groups, the more accomplished Amandul Mark II released their seminal double album Yeti. Can completed the lineup that would cement their reputation with the recruitment of singer Damo Suzuki, and Klaus Schulze joined forces with guitarist Manuel Gottsching to form Ashra Temple. Yet it was a release from an enigmatic band from Munich that pushed the musical language of the new German scene towards pure electronics. Popol Vuh were a trio fronted by the reclusive Florian Fricke, and their debut record Affenstund introduced new technologies and extraterrestrial sounds.
Popol Vuh was actually the band of Florian Fricke, and he was not a close friend of mine, but he was a friend already, and he lived outside of Munich in this little village, Miesbach, and I got to know him through Eberhard Schöner, which is was a classical conductor and classical trained musician, which became as well an electronic musician. And their houses in the countryside in this village have been maybe 5 minutes from each other. And it was '69 when I again visited Eberhard Schöner in Miesbach. We very often met there at the weekends. And the bus I took broke down, though I had to walk up this hill. Miesbach is up on a hill, yeah? Beautiful Bavarian landscape. And I heard these strange sounds. So strange. I heard a lot of this experimental music on tapes. Eberhard as well as Florian Fricke with Popol Vuh tried, and he did all this with flutes and acoustically things, but this was different. It was, I never heard a sound like this. I never heard sounds like this. It was like, well, somewhere out of space, from the moon. I couldn't figure out what it was, and it was a bit spooky as well. And I walked toward the house of Florian Fricke, and it became louder and louder, and suddenly, I knocked at the door, and his wife opened, and she said, "Psst, he has a new instrument." I said, "Oh, what is that called?" "Moog." I said, "Moog?" It's a synthesizer. And this was in the house of Florian. He had a shack behind the house filled with this Moog synthesizer, because the first Moog synthesizer was this big, like a house, yeah? And all these cables and all these strange knobs, and it was standing there. It was like really I saw a sorcerer from Mars or something like that. And he did these sounds with that.
liked Florian Frick. I met him. He lived near Munich. He had his first Moog synthesizer, this big thing. Oh, he was part of the scene, but away from it as well. At the same time, I think he behaved like this as well. I think he didn't like too much people around himself, and he was a real mystic people.
He was wealthy enough to be able to buy a Moog synthesizer in 1969. I mean, a Moog synthesizer then would have cost a lot of money. And he basically would have come in various modules being sent to him from America, and he would have to put it together. So the cost of all this, I think it had 64 keys, his one, and he spent a lot of time working on it. Remember that with a Moog, each key has to be tuned separate. If you want to make a sound, you have to tune each key. It's a very laborious process. There's an awful lot of wiring to be done. I think he's had this Moog synthesizer, and they used it, you know, to get recognition and to get. But remember, the synthesizer was a key to the German scene. They really seized on, you know, driven by Stockhausen and all the other people. They seized on instruments in a way that, you know, other cultures didn't seize on them. I mean, in America, you had records coming out like Wendy Carlos and Morton Subotnick, which were driven by commercial. Let's make electronic music commercials. You had Wendy Carlos playing Bach on, which was an enormous feat to do on an early Moog, a prototype Moog. But the Germans weren't interested in that. I mean, that's boring to them. They want to play German composers, old-fashioned. They wanted to play new sounds, make new music. And this is the difference, I think, between the two cultures.
Elektronische Musik ist eine Musik ohne Tradition. Die Sachen, die da gemacht wurden, waren in den 60ern nur einem sehr kleinen Publikum bekannt. Man denkt so, Stockhausen, das wäre so der Übervater, oder Leute wie Pierre Schaeffer. Es waren Namen, die nur sehr wenige Leute kannten. Oder die frühen Experimente mit Elektronik von Leuten wie Luigi Nono. Das war eine so Hochkultur, Avantgarde, Insidergruppe, die das kannte. Für den 16- oder 18-jährigen Jugendlichen lief der Zugang zur elektronischen Musik völlig anders. Die Tradition, die es da gab, war die des Science-Fiction-Films. Ich glaube, in vielen Musikerbiografien von Leuten, wo das Alter dann ungefähr hinhaut, wird man dann Forbidden Planet finden als den Film, der als erster mit einem kompletten elektronischen Soundtrack aufwartete. Es ist eben nicht nur das, dass diese Filmmusiken plötzlich was völlig Neues waren. Dieses Filmgenre erfreute sich ja zu dieser Zeit großer Beliebtheit. Und mehr noch als die Filme, die entsprechende Literatur. Las der junge Arbeiter Science-Fiction-Romane und träumte von einer anderen und hoffentlich besseren Welt. Und der Soundtrack dazu, nachdem man diese Filme gesehen hatte, wie Forbidden Planet, wusste man auch, wie diese Zukunft klingen muss. Der Blick ging in die Zukunft und man wählte sich eine Musik, die klanglich einfach komplett nicht nur nicht aus diesem Land, sondern auch nicht aus dieser Welt ist. Und dazu kam, dass im selben Moment, wo das Bedürfnis dazu da war, auch die technischen Mittel dafür entstanden waren. In den 60ern kamen halt genau diese Mittel der Klanggestaltung, die etwas mit Raum zu tun haben. Nachhall, Echo, also alles, was künstliche Räume kreiert, deren Klang einem sofort sagt, hier sind wir woanders. Und da passte einfach diese Stimmung. Ich glaube, nirgendwo waren die Menschen so reiselustig als junge Leute in Deutschland. Raus hier, wir wollen hier weg.
And it was within this climate of a developing electronic music scene that Kraftwerk appeared. Having been dropped from their label after the failure of the Organisation record, Ralf Hutter and Florian Schneider regrouped and renamed their outfit. Literally translated as power plant, Kraftwerk were one of the few groups within the scene that had chosen a German name, and it perfectly summed up their aesthetic goals. A major city situated in the heart of Germany's main industrial area, Düsseldorf itself provided a key influence for Hutter and Schneider. Since the war, the area had been developed and renovated, and this progressive modern industrial world would be reflected in Kraftwerk's music. Featuring the twin drumming of Andreas Hohmann and future Neu member Klaus Dinger, Kraftwerk once again called on Conny Plank to record their self-titled debut in August 1970, assisted by engineer Klaus Lohmer.
Conny hat es mir dann alle vorgestellt und dann haben wir eigentlich da experimentiert. Keiner wusste eigentlich genau, was machen wir eigentlich da. Da haben die ja so ein Schlagzeug aufgebaut, das war aber so ein Kinderschlagzeug, wo die dann gespielt haben. Wir haben Soundcheck gemacht und rumprobiert. Und eines Tages war auch mal eine Grille im Studio, das war ein Riesenstudio. Und dann haben wir so einen großen Galgen da hochgefahren, haben dann einen Song, ich weiß nicht, ob der auf der CD drauf ist oder auf dem Album, einen Song mit einer Grille gemacht. Die war aber live im Studio, ne? Und das war eigentlich immer toll. Man hat immer probiert, war natürlich auch ein bisschen so, manchmal im Rausch, das gehörte dazu damals, ne? Und so ist das alles entstanden. Der ist offen für alles. Der hat auch hier die Blackfoes produziert, also eine Kölner Gruppe, die Karneval machen. Gianna Nannini kam hier hin. Der war einfach ein Typ, der konnte auf die Menschen zugehen, konnte das rauskitzeln, was derjenige hat, ne? Da war ein Fachmann drin, ne? Und eben die Ruhe selbst, wenn dann einer nicht so konnte, das war ganz in Ruhe, ganz relaxed, nochmal und dann machen wir das noch. Der hat sich wirklich viel, viel Mühe gegeben, ne? Die konnten schon ganz gut spielen, aber sie haben eigentlich immer nur probiert, so habe ich das in Erinnerung, das ist ja schon etwas länger her, ne? Technisch gut spielen konnten sie eigentlich nicht, aber sie hatten eben tolle Ideen und mit dem wenigen kann man vergleichen mit dem Gitarrist von Procol Harum, der hatte eigentlich nichts drauf, aber die paar Töne, die er gespielt hat, die saßen, das war bei denen genauso, ne?
Kraftwerk's self-titled debut was issued in late 1970 on the Philips label, only months after the release of Tone Float. With both accessible and highly experimental material contained across its 4 tracks, it went on to sell 60,000 copies in Germany.
It was distinguished by the use of the flute. I mean, the flute and very light keyboards and this lovely patina of percussion that they were generating from the bass keys of the keyboard. And there was a lightness to it and there was a clarity to it that was very different. They were going for a much more minimalistic sound. It wasn't a huge band improvising in the studio. It wasn't loud and noisy and hitting you over the head. It was basically sounds and music that was very well organized.
Musikalisch finde ich das immer noch toll, ne? Also bei dem Ruckzuck, wir das aufgenommen haben, also da waren wir selber so begeistert, dass wir das immer wieder hören mussten und immer dran gearbeitet haben. Da wusste man, das ist es. Das Das spürt man dann. Ne? Es gibt so im Studio verschiedene Situationen, wenn auf einmal man das immer wieder hören will, was man da aufgenommen hat, dann ist da irgendwas dran. Ne?
Rucksack was a track that was solidly based on building rhythms and putting them together in a way that, you know, would become memorable and danceable too, I should imagine. So they were interested in compressing their sound in a way and creating a rhythmic stride to it that would appeal, I should imagine. They were trying to be appealing as well as, you know, revolutionary.
The thing about Kraftwerk 1 is that it ends with this track, Von Himmel hoch, or coming down from the heavens. And it just sounds like falling bombs coming down on top of you and exploding. And that would be very pertinent to the German experience. The difference between Kraftwerk and the other bands wish to totally disassociate themselves from the past of the Germans' history. And they also wish to actually make a totally new, using the hippie ideal of freeform improvisation. But Kraftwerk were different. They were willing to embrace the past. And in so doing, they actually, in the long term, they invented a new kind of aesthetic that people around the world could really relate to by using humor and experiment and brilliant understanding of electronic sound. They've made their own, they basically remade German identity and made it something to actually look at. And you can feel it on Kraftwerk 1. They're actually willing to embrace the fact that a lot of bombs were both dropped on and by Germany. And this is an experience that, let's say, Stockhausen had gone through firsthand, being a stretcher bearer in the Second World War. A lot of bombs were dropped on him. He escaped. And so this was a very brave thing to do in some ways. And it was obviously they weren't going to shun the past.
I missed the organization record, and I think whole Germany missed it because it was not released here. So it started really with the first Kraftwerk here. Well, again, people made jokes and said, it's like, well, are they with the tape in a noisy house? What do they do? Yeah, this is not music. This is, maybe it's experimental music. Yes, we can accept that. But it has nothing to do with the underground scene, with the alternative scene, with the rock scene. It's okay, it might be interesting, but it is something for a very limited audience. Yeah, for the art people or something.
Indeed, Kraftwerk promoted the album with a tour not of rock clubs, but of universities, parties and art galleries. A modest success and released only domestically, it nevertheless introduced the band to new listeners and placed them on the musical map. During the first half of 1971, however, the band underwent many dramatic changes. Ralf Hutter unexpectedly quit, leaving Florian Schneider to lead a perpetually changing ensemble. Eventually, guitarist Michael Rother joined the band, with Klaus Dinger the lone drummer. Although this lineup did record several tracks with Conny Plank and made a TV appearance, it was not to last. Yet the German scene itself was proving that it did have staying power, with Ashra Tempel's groundbreaking self-titled debut Unleashed in June, and both Cluster and Popol Vuh's second albums faring well with the critics, and ensuring that they kept their small but secure audiences. Festivals and performances featuring the scene's leading lights continued to introduce the various bands to new listeners, and the release of Cannes' seminal Tego Mego proved that experimental German music was alive and well in the new decade. Many of these acts, including Kraftwerk, were now releasing music that was totally unlike anything produced anywhere else in the world.
We were pretty much aware that we weren't raised in the Mississippi Delta, or we weren't raised in Liverpool, and it was certainly not our identity. And having an artistic mind somehow, probably I didn't know at that time, I think our generation had to come up with a counterpoint to that. It doesn't make sense really to play the music you really love, you really like. It's one thing, but coming up with an own genuine idea and by defining your own reality and your own culture, you have to come up with some other thing.
Es wird gern gesagt, naja, die Entstehung von Krautrock hätte was damit zu tun, dass die Bands hier in Deutschland sich gesagt hätten, ja, also Rock'n'Roll als typisch amerikanische Musik können wir gar nicht so gut spielen. Also es ist nicht so, dass man sagte, okay, wir können kein Rock'n'Roll spielen, also erfinden wir etwas anderes. Also so, als hätte es da eine Diskussion gegeben und einen Plan. Es ergab sich von selber.
It was just one area in America where suddenly, yeah, it was the scene, yeah. And suddenly you had the feeling, so many musicians, so many bands, so many influences, so this just can happen once, I think, yeah. It was the Blütezeit, the blooming, yeah, of German music at its peak.
By September 1971, work began on Kraftwerk's second album. Michael Rother and Klaus Dinger had by now departed to form Neu, who would become one of the most influential bands on the German scene, and Hutter and Schneider were now reduced to a duo. Having begun work on the construction of a personal studio the previous year, the pair recorded their fresh compositions both at this newly built location in Düsseldorf and at Conny Plank's studio in Hamburg. The result of their labours was the album Kraftwerk 2.
I think with each subsequent Kraftwerk album, they are stripping back something a little bit more and more, but of course it's still with the stage of Kraftwerk 2. They are still using what you might call conventional instruments, but using them almost as if they were electronic instruments in some ways, and they are experimenting with laying down different configurations, different patterns, working with kind of repetitions, almost using the instrument as a thing in itself, you know, exploring textures, as it were, rather than text, you know, still reluctant to introduce vocals. And so it is, you know, looking back at the time, I mean, they've disavowed those albums of Kraftwerk. They don't really want people to hear them. They'd rather that the year zero of Kraftwerk occurred a little bit further down the line in the mid-70s somewhere. But you can, you know, these albums are actually eminently listenable as things in their own right, and you can see the direction they're heading in.
To be honest, a lot of the tracks on Kraftwerk 1 and 2 are basically experiments. There's not many on those albums which are that melodic, with the exception of, say, Kling Klang on the second record, which is the defining moment in Kraftwerk, where they come up with this glacial motoric, so a motoric beat and then the glacial keyboards and flutes over the top, which is their trademark. And this is what happened on Kling Klang. I think they probably came upon that, and this would be the sound that would define them, because obviously they couldn't keep on just doing experiments.
The synthesizers, it synthesizes sounds, you know, forming the basis of the sound. They're directing it, they're leading it, they're shaping it, and I mean, there are no vocals. You've got instruments like flute just playing a kind of very supplementary role, kind of filling in, adding colour here and there. And in fact, they would use electronics to create that kind of effect later on. they've got these wonderful little vari-speed effects going on as well. And in a sense, with that album, particularly that track, they are kind of setting the tone for what they're going to do the rest of their career, that kind of futuristic yet serene, you know, it's the equivalent of the painter like Fernand Léger with these kind of friendly robots handing out flowers that, you know, the future, new technology need not be something that mankind should be at odds with. But the rest of the album doesn't really tie with that. The rest of the album is more kind of, you know, it's more kind of fragments of experimentation and ideas that they would eventually you know, dispense.
Really, their music is more about concision, right? Where the other albums, where you get these double Amondoul and double Ashra Temple albums, just all. I mean, you could pick up. I used to pick up the needle in the record shop I worked in Dublin. I used to put it down anywhere, and it would be just like, and we just wouldn't have to then flip it over and put it down in the middle of the track, and it would be just a load of stuff. Forget it. But with Kraftwerk, you wanted to listen to each track because it had some kind of structure, where there wasn't any structure on the early Amondoul Ashra Temple albums.
My favorite Kraftwerk track of all times is this piece called Strom, where they were just demonstrating the electric guitar, an instrument that was not very important for them. But so I mean, that was already so obvious how that they had a completely different attitude towards instrument. The instruments were not instruments in the sense of instrumental for production of something that has been conceived elsewhere, but they had a life of their own. You know? You put on an electric guitar, let's see what it does. Obviously, the aesthetic investment was into something completely different from what all the other bands were into. All the other bands were into was the most different means, but they were all into experience. Everything was about having an experience with music. And Kraftwerk was not that. It was obviously about distance to music. There was something conceptual, there was something humorous, there was irony. But on the other hand, it was not comedy. It was not openly ironic. It was not the Bonzo Dog Duda band or something like that. So it was that was even from me as a 13-year-old clearly different from anything else.
Yet during 1972, the scene continued to diversify. Bands such as Can, who followed up the landmark Tego Mego with the equally successful Ig Bamyazi, persevered in their exploration of the extreme possibilities of rock music, while the electronic field continued to evolve. Edgar Froese's Tangerine Dream had released the albums Alpha Centauri and Zeit, in which the band had progressed from the experimental psychedelia of electronic meditation into an atmospheric sound that Froese himself termed cosmic music. And former member Klaus Schulze, who had also been testing the boundaries of psychedelic rock with Ashra Temple, emerged as a prominent electronic musician in his own right with his debut solo record, Irrlicht.
I want to do at this time 100% electronic music, not the compromise with let's say conventional instruments creating new sounds. I said, why don't we start with a synthesizer and make a new sound instead of playing a guitar backwards or whatever, and sing. But they were still so they still want to have it as an important part of this music. They want to have traditional drums and traditional guitar. Okay, they have some, they give, let's say in 1 hour, they give you 5 minutes to just freak out with this. But then we have to come back to this. And this, I was really fed up. I said, no, I do it alone. Because at this time I was parallel, also during Tangerine time. I was doing at home, experimenting with it. With a tape recorder, a little bit like Music Concretion, but because at this time we had no synthesizer, because they came quite late to Europe, and also were incredible expensive at this time. Today you can have a studio for that, you know. I didn't even know where I'm going alone. But like in the beginning with electronic meditation or with first ashra, if it would not work, I would probably be a painter or a teacher or whatever. But it worked relatively fast, because when I released Irrlicht, it was, I think half a year later, it was kind of a top 10 album in France.
Klaus Schulze is an interesting case, and Irrlicht is, again, an album which not only connects with some of the sort of like minimalist things going on, and people like in some ways Phil Niblock to a certain extent, although it's much more accessible than his work, and to the kind of more sort of drone-based experimental electronica of the 21st century. So yes, he peels away from Tangerine Dream, as it were, and he does establish this kind of own very individual furrow.
Klaus Schulze's Irrlicht is a sort of precursor to drone music. It sort of straddles what Sun Ra was doing and, say, what the drone rock bands like Sun and people like that are doing in the 90s and onwards. But it has a very cosmic feel to it, but a very dark edge cosmic feel. You're on the dark side of the moon, if you know what I mean. You're in dark space. It's pretty bleak out there. Irrlicht is also a kind of early minimalism as well. It's stripping everything down to the bare essentials of what the entire Krautrock movement, and particularly what Tangerine Dream were doing and what Ashra Temple were doing, down to the very minimum. I think he's sort of honed it right down so that you're hearing the very essence of what he was trying to do within those two groups.
He was this Einzelgänger, this solo person. Not really introvert like Florian Fricke, much more open-minded, but I think he was a person who had to do everything under control. There was a part of journalists and media who took him very serious from on the beginning. It was mostly from the classical department. The classical departments in radio and media found this is new classic. And I think they are right. He still is.
I know myself that it's a very simple, structured album, Irrlicht, but it is a groundbreaking album in terms of aesthetic. You know, not from a playing and all this, but and this has an importance. And then I said, oh yeah, it worked, and then I made one record after another, nearly 100 till now.
While artists such as Schulze and Neu were establishing their reputation as key figures in the German movement, Kraftwerk laid low during 1972, performing few concert dates and working further on developing their studio. Their first two albums were repackaged as a double LP in the UK, but the release did little to spread awareness of the duo outside of their homeland. After performing their first concerts outside of Germany in early 1973, two French shows which were very favourably reviewed by the local press, they once again enlisted Conny Plank to engineer the sessions for their next album, Ralph und Florian. Released at the end of the year, it was a notable progression from their previous two records.
Ralph and Florian is, I think, is the breakthrough album for Kraftwerk. It's a 1973 album. It's extremely melodic, it's extremely constant, it has wonderful tracks on it. Some of the tracks could be like, you know, electronic classical music. There's a track called Dance Music, which if you put it on now, it sounds like it was made yesterday. There's a thickness to the percussion sounds, which gives it that depth, that real depth. And there's a crystal clarity to the keyboard sounds and the flute sounds. But also this strong, wistful romanticism is coming in. The kind of Mahlerian, Wagnerian thing is coming in. And they're bringing that into the music. And there's this kind of strange kind of nostalgia even. I think Eno called it a strange nostalgia for the future. And like there's a strange nostalgia in that for a future, but also that reflects the past. And then there's the humor, of course, calling something a pineapple symphony, you know. I think as an album, it's a wonderful album. Also, it's a very ambient album in parts. Some of us are very quiet. And none of it has any noise or loudness to it. And there's no like screaming rock guitars on it. But there's elements of psychedelia there. There's treated guitars, but there isn't like, it is a wonderful record. It's a beautiful record, actually.
I do like Ralph and Florian. Alana Symphony in particular is a track which could have easily been made in the last 10 years. And you listen to something that could have been made by something like the Orb or whatever, something like that. It's quite astonishingly ahead of its time, and it's exploring quite a lot of ideas which, in fact, Kraftwerk themselves eventually dispensed with. But again, it has this kind of, there's things like this sort of Hawaiian guitars and like waves gently crashing against the sea. And I mean, I suppose what they're doing there is they're establishing this aspect of serenity, which I think is key to Kraftwerk, which they're using in a kind of slightly different way later on. But it's actually just it isn't just a kind of stepping stone on the way to Autobahn and Man Machine. It is a wonderfully listenable album in its own right.
As well as introducing more serene elements into the album's musical content, with Ralph and Florian, Kraftwerk began to assume a very particular visual identity. In 1973, Schneider and Hutter had met violinist and artist Emil Schult. Initially simply a musical collaborator, Schult's extensive studies in the arts at Düsseldorf Academy would lead him to become a pivotal background figure in the overall Kraftwerk setup. The album not only included a bizarre comic book conceived and illustrated by Schult, but he also played a key part in the overall cover design, in which the names Ralph and Florian were written in a distinctively German typeface, and which featured a photo of the pair looking less like rock musicians and more like scientists. Here, Ralph and Florian were not only the musicians, but also the very abstracted subject of the record, and this development of a unique and clearly German visual identity would play a vital role in the future of the band.
The idea they had of themselves was much more of being kind of a artist in the sense, a type of artist that emerged in the visual art world at that time, after Warhol and Gilbert and George, who were also very important, I think, for Kraftwerk. This kind of artist that was not longer just working in one field or around one problem or one question, but tried to produce an entire artificial character that would be changeable between different worlds, that could be used on a record cover as well as on as in an exhibition place or on a stage. This kind of mobility of an image is something that comes from pop music, and it's something that has been adopted by the visual arts in a more professional and or in a more conceptual way in the 60s. And I think that was something that Kraftwerk adopted. That was one thing. I think one thing was the there's a camp aspect that we are not saying explicitly what we want, but we are leaving it up to you, and we give you all kind of material to project on. The second was this idea of an artist that they had basically taken from the visual arts. And the third thing was that they at one point discovered this idea of Germanness as some kind of artificial idea that was not connected to some kind of German nationalism or ideas of Germanness that existed historically and that are all being tainted, of course, by National Socialism or by the Nazis. So it was something new, and I think these three ideas came together, and that made this uniqueness. Because all the subjects after Ralph and Florian were somehow coded as German.
While Ralph and Florian were busy developing their own unique brand in Düsseldorf, 1973 was a breakthrough year for many of the German bands. In England, Richard Branson's Virgin Records, a newly established independent label, was on the lookout for new signings after the worldwide success of Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells, their first release. Virgin had originally been a small record shop specializing in prog rock and imports from the German scene, and Branson decided to bring some of the more prominent artists to a UK audience.
The first thing where we, let's say, made some money, which was nearly nothing, was in France over a couple of years, and then Richard Branson liked it. This kind of German music he liked. He signed Ken, he signed Faust, he signed Tangerine Dream, Usher Temple, myself, and so. And through that, I think through Virgin Records in the beginning, this kind of music was really successful. I don't know, he must have a special feeling for or maybe he just said it's such a freaky music, nobody would dare to do such shit or something. I don't know what he was thinking at this time. The only thing which I know is that definitely he never listened to the music.
By far, the most noteworthy of his signings was Tangerine Dream. With the release of their 1973 LP, Atom, they had already gained essential publicity in the UK when the record was championed by pioneering DJ John Peel, who went on to name it his album of the year. In their native Germany and in France, Froze's group had been both commercially and critically successful, and their signing to Virgin propelled them onto the global stage. Their debut Virgin release, Phaedra, hit the UK top 20 in 1974 and achieved six-figure sales. It also departed from the more experimental sound of their previous records and introduced what would become their trademark sequencer-driven soundscapes.
Edgar Froese did approach Branson, and he had a very good deal for Branson. He said, we make a lot of music, so you can put out music by Tangerine Dream and music by us as solo musicians as well. You can put out 2 or 3 albums a year, and we can give you this for as very little money, as long as you get the Mogs over and you help us with the. And they were getting a lot of demand for performance. They had a massive reputation as a great live act, and that live they were awesome. And they built a great reputation from touring endlessly in Germany. I think probably those kind of things would have interested Branson. He would have seen the figures, seen the amount of people. So well, obviously there's an audience here, and he wasn't wrong. I mean, because their albums were massive hits in the UK. The thing about Tangerine Dream, unlike other German bands, was that when you heard the records, you did not feel that human beings were playing them. You didn't feel that these records were being kind of pushed forward by human beings. It was as if the actual instruments had a life of their own. The instruments were actually playing themselves, and they were making all these incredible sounds. And they were very good at texture. Tangerine Dream. Everything seemed to meld into each other, and it also had a very strong rhythmic content. And it was different. It didn't have the random sounds of a lot of the experimental music, and it didn't have the the kind of noise side of, say, Noi or those bands, or even Kraftwerk. It was very melodic and very, very consonant, very complete. But it was as if the instrument was playing itself, and he had these wonderful burbling, bubbling sequences, bubbling music coming over. And of course, you know, Richard Branson sees it and said, bring them over to England and they can record it here. And it was a huge, huge hit. And it was enormously influential. I don't think Tangerine Dream, because they took their name from a Beatles song, they were, I think it's Lucy in the Sky with Diamond, I think they, in a lot of ways, they weren't actually even seen as a German band. And when they'd play, of course, you couldn't see them. You didn't know what they looked like. There was no pictures on the album. It was just like psychedelic-looking covers or a blue cover with something melting in it. And when you went to a Tangerine Dream concert, all you got was like these banks of flickering lights, and there was three people, in front of them with their backs to the audience playing them, but you never saw their faces. You didn't care either, because the music was just pouring out, and it was
kind of sound like hard work, really. But I think he was more and more interested in the commercial aspects of his sound than experimentation anymore. I think he was interested in perfection and cleaning it up to the point where all the guts had been washed out of it.
In the end, I find Tangerine Dream in a kind of mid-period rather disappointing. You go back and listen to some of those albums, and while they might well have seemed like tremendously impressive at times, especially with the latest stereophonic equipment or whatever, they really don't sound all that hot. I mean, they remind you of like, I don't know, the sort of TV soundtrack music we get to kind of horses, helicopter shots of horses running along near cliff edges and things like that. They're kind of scampering sequences sort of quality. I always think it's a tremendous shame, and I think they are one of the examples of like Krautrock's kind of sort of curiosity, sonic curiosity, its embracing of like electronics, synthesizers or whatever, being taken up a rather sort of disappointingly orthodox and functional path, which is mostly, a kind of mock grandiose sort of quality, or simply music that's just good soundtrack music.
While Tangerine Dream were busy making their presence felt in the UK, Kraftwerk were preparing to make their own impression on the international market. Having pared down their operations for the past two albums, Ralph and Florian decided to introduce new musicians to the mix when they began recording at their studios in the summer of 1974. They drafted in percussionist Wolfgang Flür and multi-instrumentalist Klaus Roeder to add new elements to the Kraftwerk sound.
Ich kam 1974 zu Kraftwerk und zusammen mit Wolfgang Flür und die beiden, also Ralf und Florian, bestimmten eigentlich, was gemacht wird. Wir wussten oft gar nicht, was dran ist, der Wolfgang auch nicht. Kraftwerk ist Ralf und Florian. Das andere war immer nur zusätzlich. Sie haben dann Leute fast wie bezahlte Musiker eingestellt. Das haben diese Musiker auch nicht immer so gut gefunden. Aber also ich persönlich fand das so okay, weil ich mich auch so gesehen habe. Ich habe mir gesagt, okay, ich spiele mit denen mit und alles, die bestimmen, was gemacht wird, das ist okay.
Hutter and Schneider's studio in Düsseldorf, now named Klingklang, was the locus of Kraftwerk's operations. And since its inception, the pair had been continually developing it, adding new instruments and designing new equipment that would help them realize their sound.
Das Studio damals von Kraftwerk, das war im Hinterhof ein größerer Raum. Das war vielleicht früher mal ein Fabrikraum, könnte ich mir denken. Das war ganz abgeschottet von einem Rolltor. Das berühmte Rolltor, glaube ich, als ich zum ersten Mal dahin kam, da wurde dann plötzlich, ich habe geläutet und dann ging so langsam ein ganz schweres Rolltor auf. Dann ging man da rein, noch durch so einen Gang. Und dann kam man in diesen Raum, der war ziemlich groß, der war nicht irgendwie getüncht. Und da standen dann vereinzelt, stand zum Beispiel ein riesiger Hornlautsprecher, der war selbst gebaut. Ich glaube, der Florian hat das mal gemacht. Oder bauen lassen viel auch. Die haben sich sehr viel bauen lassen von Freunden, die sie da hatten. Dann so, diese Elektroniktrams gab es noch nicht, aber so verschiedene Geräte, die selbst gebaut waren, und dann eben auch diese einfachen Synthesizer, die man damals hatte. Der Synthi A war da und dann standen halt diese ganzen. Dann war so Ralf und Florian mit Neon, das war alles schön aufgebaut. Ne? Das ist ja auch ziemlich bekannt, glaube ich, diese Schrift aus Neon. Da hatten sie auch eine Firma, die das extra für sie gemacht hat. Ralf und Florian hatten immer die richtigen Freunde, die genau wussten, wie die Technik beherrschten. Da gehörte dann der Conny auch dazu. Der Conny war wichtig im Studio und das alles perfekt zu machen. Ich nehme an, dass das später genauso gut gemacht wurde, aber damals war Conny für die Aufnahmen doch sehr wichtig. Und Ralf und Florian hatten immer diese bekannten oder Studiomenschen und auch Bastler durchaus, die ihnen diese Technik so hergestellt haben, wie sie das brauchten. Das ging so weit bis zu den Cases, wo die Sachen reintaten. Die wurden extra angefertigt, so aus Alu-Behälter, wo man dann zu den Gigs mit diesen Alu-Behältern fuhr. Das war, glaube ich, sehr wichtig auch. Und die elektronischen Geräte eben wurden auch gebaut.
The result of their labours was the album Autobahn. Released in Germany and the UK at the tail end of 1974, it was the last LP that Ralph and Florian would record with producer Conny Plank, and it was the album that catapulted them onto the international stage. At its centre was the title track, a 20-minute opus that took up the whole of the record's first side. The duo would eventually dismiss their first 3 albums, and they chose to reimagine this record as Kraftwerk Year Zero.
The ideal thing was that in Autobahn, it really had a subject matter that combined all the ideas they were thinking of. That was the genius thing about it, that all of a sudden they had a subject matter. So far they were these conceptualists were thinking about ideas of how to be an artist or how to be a musician in the pop world with all these visual artists concepts around, but they didn't have a concept matter. They didn't have a subject matter. And then the idea of the Germanness was the next thing, but that was still something that had to be concretized every time in a specific way. And here they had everything together. They had a highly musical subject matter, the road. Then the specific German version of it was this problematic thing, the proverbial achievement of the fascists, that it's always this kind of proverbial talk of the Germans after the Second World War said, yeah, Hitler wasn't so bad after all. He shouldn't have done this with the Jews, but at least he built the Autobahn. That's this kind of, so Autobahn means this too. And then of course it's the musical aesthetic of that, something that takes from minimalism the unfinishedness of music. Music that has a structure that's not saying there's a climax at one point we come to an end, but it's possibly endless. All this together was a great moment.
Autobahn is, I think Ralph Butcher has said that he was very much influenced by the Beach Boys, and in this particular case, he said that the Beach Boys to him made music that sounded like America, and he wanted a music that sounded like Germany that he was going to make, and it's a kind of tone poem, and it's a very sort of picturesque piece of music, and there is this kind of conscious homage to the Beach Boys. Fahren, fahren, fahren. It's like which travel, as in we travel, slightly awkward German, like fun, 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 until Daddy takes the T-bird away. So there's that kind of conscious allusion to the Beach Boys. But what's wonderful about the main piece, and I think that really is the essence of the album, these sort of, over its 17, 18 minutes or whatever, is that you just get this, it's like a sonic transcription of a car journey, from the kind of ignition and setting off, and then kind of bowling sort of nicely along the road, then hitting heavy traffic. It would have seemed perhaps a very odd subject matter to some of the people that had maybe followed sort of Kraftwerk generally, or sort of the alternative German rock scene, for somebody to be kind of offering a hymn of praise to something like a motorway. But Kraftwerk, they do these things with a very, very wry smile. They're probably kind of aware of the kind of hackles they're raising when they do these things, and they kind of pose there looking slightly effeminate and very un-rock and roll. But it's as well as being an exquisite piece of music, it's very cleverly provocative as well.
Fahren, fahren, fahren auf
was happening with Autobahn was that the actual, before when you heard the sounds, you knew it was coming from a source. And that somebody was trying to make a sound coming from a source, and that's a treated guitar, or that's an oscillator, or that's a keyboard. But with Autobahn, you sort of forgot about what the instruments sound like, and just were more just completely caught up in this motoric melody and this driving motoric rhythm, and then this melody, and then the voice going Autobahn over, and the whole thing gelled into like what we call music, where you actually forget about the instruments and you just listen to the music itself, and you're brought along with the music. I think certainly the first side of Autobahn, they become like really great musicians. But then the second side of Autobahn, for some reason, they go back to experiment, whether these experiments were experiments that were lying around or stuff that was old stuff that they hadn't finished. But really the second side is probably a side that people don't listen to, because it's going back to the Kraftwerk 1 and 2 experiments. But certainly the first side made them international for the time, pop stars.
Das wesentlichen Punkt hat ja der Conny Blank gespielt, eine wesentliche Rolle, der eigentlich alles gemixt hat und wirklich einzelne Teilchen zusammengesetzt hat, und hinterher wurde dann das Stück draus. Und das war, glaube ich, sogar das letzte Mal, dass Conny das gemacht hat. Und er hat noch zu mir gesagt, er wüsste nicht genau, wie ein Kraftwerk klingt, wenn er das nicht mehr macht. Das war schon sehr wichtig auch.
I'm quite sure that the idea was making a statement on the realm of pop music, but with our German identity. And if you listen closely to the first two records of Ralph and Florian, they really came from this classical angle. That's how I see it. And then they moved towards pop music, of course, by adding lyrics. There's no pop music without lyrics, apparently. And by using the German lyrics and using this word Fahn, which could be understood in the English language as fun. And you had this connection to the Beach Boys, to fun on the Autobahn, and using some of these German idioms like Autobahn and stuff like that, using the picture of the Volkswagen and the Mercedes-Benz, that opened up a door, a new door. And I think that's part of the success of Autobahn, of the first worldwide selling Kraftwerk record, actually.
This articulation of German identity was not only a key ingredient of the track's success abroad, but also restated Kraftwerk's difference to their contemporaries. While the other German bands were keen to distance themselves from their homeland, Kraftwerk's use of lyrics sung in their native tongue would be a real rarity not only on the UK and US charts.
This was novelty in German too, because if you were singing in German, you were immediately part of another tradition of German pop music, the Schlager culture. And the Schlager culture is something that was always right-wing and even worse than right-wing, partly. It was definitely reactionary. So singing in German was politically impossible.
Wärst du doch in Düsseldorf geblieben, schöner Playboy, du wirst nie ein Cowboy sein. Wärst du doch in Düsseldorf geblieben, das wär besser für dich und für Düsseldorf am Rhein.
Diesen Klischees, die die deutsche Popmusik, also der Schlager hat, der eine sehr formalisierte Sprache hat, in der also in ganz klaren Formeln über Liebe, Heimat, solche Dinge verhandelt wird. Da wird über Liebe gesprochen, aber in so einer kalten, festgelegten Form, dass es mit irgendwelchen realen Menschen und einer realen Liebe gar nichts mehr zu tun hat. Das haben Kraftwerk karikiert. Oder so hat man sie hier in Deutschland gehört. Ihre offensichtlich unsinnigen Texte, die auch nicht den Versuch machten, irgendwie tiefsinnig zu sein. Und zwar so offensichtlich, dass es dann wieder ein künstlerisches Statement war. Es war eine Karikatur des Schlagers, so wie ihre Krawatten, ihre Frisuren eine Karikatur des disziplinierten, fleißigen Deutschen waren.
Despite such culturally specific elements, the record became a massive hit in the US and the UK. After being picked up by a radio station in Chicago, the Autobahn single hit the top 30 in the US, and the album reached the top 5 on both sides of the Atlantic.
It was a huge record, and it allowed them to then tour, America and stuff like that. For the first time, they could actually go and tour in the States, which was like a huge breakthrough. Yes, of course. And I think for the first time, Americans and British could see that some German music was really, really fantastic to hear, and friendly and warm, and wasn't, as Ian MacDonald had said many years later, cold and unemotional. It was very emotional, and it was very funny as well.
Before departing for the tour, the structure of the group changed once more. Keen on the more expansive sound as well as the image of a four-piece, when Klaus Ruder quit the group, he was instantly replaced with another percussionist, music student Karl Bartos.
Well, my professor said, hey Karl, it was 75. I've got this telephone call now. There's this band called Kraftwerk. They need a classical trained percussionist. Here's the number, call them. And I called back, and actually it was Florian Schneider on the phone, and at that time we were all very casual. So I got phone calls every day, playing there, playing there, playing there. And I got there, and I just, as far as I remember, I took my vibraphone. I had a vibraphone, and Florian came to my flat, and we were carrying this vibraphone to the Klingklang studio. They put some sheet music in front of me, and it was a song, as far as I remember, it was Kometenmelodie. So it was basically a major scale. I was playing this from the sheet music, and a little riff here, a little riff there. And we were laughing, had some fun, and that was it. I was in the band.
Kraftwerk arrived in the US in April for the 22-date tour. And now performing as a four-piece, the band all adopted short hair and dressed in suits, a collective ensemble for the first time, and an antithesis of everything rock was about in America. Yet many in the audience viewed them very much as a passing musical fad.
I think at that time we were received as some sort of gimmick group. Only very few people could foresee what potential was in Kraftwerk. I think even though we played in Detroit, we played almost everywhere. At that time, it was too far out, too strange. We were playing in suits, short hair. I was playing electronic drums. We had a mini Moog. Ralph was playing a mini Moog, a Farfisa organ. I still have it. I nicked it off him, so it's in my basement collecting dust. And Florian was playing an ARP Odyssey synthesizer, and Wolfgang and me were playing electronic drums, and my vibraphone, of course. And it was a very odd performance, very, very odd, I think.
Despite the strangeness of the experience, the single, the album and the tour were highly lucrative for Hutter and Schneider, and they reinvested their profits back into Klingklang Studios. Here they returned to work on a new album, and as with Autobahn, it would again center on a single concept.
You know, after Sgt. Pepper, everybody was doing concept records, and it became a little bit out of fashion then. And I think looking at the classical composers like Cage, Stockhausen, there was always a strong concept behind their work. It's impossible to make really good music without a concept, even if you go to a strong music coming from other cultures, like Indian music or whatever, there's always a strong concept behind it, which is deeply based in their ethnic background. And being part of, we always felt really as Germans, later really more as Europeans. And of course, coming also from the classical background, you have to come up with a thought, with a theme. We always went into a production of a record, and we put pictures on the console. We always had some pictures around, and you know, even if you improvise music, if you sing a track, if you make some la-las, it's always good if your mind is in a direction. It's much better if you look metaphorically in one direction instead of being nowhere. It's always good being somewhere if you play music. And that was one of the strongest parts of Kraftwerk, and that's why I really felt very good being part of this movement and being part of Kraftwerk, actually, yeah.
Working solely out of the improved kling-klang, the context in which the band would now function had changed. Having negotiated a new deal with EMI, Hutter and Schneider took over production duties on their records. Although both Fleur and Bartos were brought on board the sessions for the new album, the control over Kraftwerk product was now entirely in the hands of Ralph and Florian.
From Radioactivity on, Ralph and Florian became the producer of Kraftwerk, so they took this part. And it felt very natural because it was not at that time. I hadn't really the feeling it was teamwork. It was just Ralph and Florian's record. Kraftwerk was just, I would say I was part-time Kraftwerker. Although it opened up really a possibility for the future, but I didn't know at that time.
Released at the close of 1975, Radioactivity was a very different record from Autobahn. Around a concept combining both the themes of nuclear energy and the radio itself, Kraftwerk delivered an album of shorter tracks with a more accomplished and polished use of the new technology available to them.
Certainly with Radioactivity, you get to the point where Kraftwerk are operating in, as it were, smaller sound units. It's a very sort of conceptually very self-contained album. It's dispensed entirely with the early krautrock habit of going off on sort of lengthy, meandering jams. They're working in a sort of almost, a sort of, I won't say proto-pop format, but proto the kind of pop that they helped give rise to. And I think that has to do with the fact that they're kind of, as it were, they brought the whole thing in-house. They're working on it themselves. In terms of the sort of the personnel working there, they've got like the kind of that four-way division of labour and everything like that. Even though Ralph Hutter and Florian Schneider are obviously very much to the fore. And yes, and it does feel as it is produced under some sort of aesthetic factory conditions all of a sudden.
It's a very poetic record. Very poetic record utilizing this, the art form of a radio play, actually. It's sort of a radio play, and listening to pieces like Antenna or Om Sweet Om, it's really, really very much on the surface. It has got this German soul, a lot of it, or this romantic feeling.
And the album also pushed Kraftwerk's sound into new areas, with the conventional instrumentation of their earlier records discarded. Like Stockhausen before them, the band were moving into entirely electronic territory.
Pure electronics element on Radioactivity is pretty discernible right from the very beginning, because of the reason they were using all this electronic equipment and had sort of totally done away with orthodox instrumentation like the flute and the drums and everything else like that. Everything had been turned electronic. So this was a new turning point for them, really. They were interested in purely machine-made music, and this is where the bare bones of the next stage of the Kraftwerk sound would begin.
A key instrument in their evolving sound was the Waco Orchestron, a 1975 synthesizer that was never mass-produced and which broadened Kraftwerk's sound palette.
Basically, the orchestra, to me, it sounds like the mellotron, but it has got this infinite loops. A mellotron had just a finite. The loops stopped after 20 seconds, so you had to only play just short notes. Listen to Strawberry Fields. But I remember Florian, or Ralph and Florian, they went to this music fair in Frankfurt. And there was suddenly just one of a part of the exhibitions there, and she just immediately bought it because it had just this strange, old-fashioned gramophone sound of recordings, Edison type of 1867. To me, it was always sort of mellotron. And it was functioning on, they had just acetate discs or plastic discs, and they had different loops, infinite loops going on. But the best were apparently strings, which went on to Trans-Europe Express, and choir, which went on to Radioactivity.
And as with Autobahn, this title track was both accessible and melodic, and proved the Kraftwerk were able to produce commercial material.
Tune into the melody, radioactivity is in the air for you and me.
It's sung in English for the first time, so they start singing in English, and it sounds like a pop track. It's so consonant, and it glides along, bops along very well. They say radioactivity. But remember, the radio was such an important part of German culture, particularly, see this again, they're addressing the war. People used to cluster around the radio in Germany, and every day, every night, to hear what Hitler was going to say. Like the way they clustered around the radio in the UK to hear what Churchill was going to say. There was a part of that as well in the concert. You were looking backwards to look forwards kind of thing. And the whole thing is a concert. In some ways, they use oscillators and they use a lot of electronic devices. In some ways, it's quite an austere record. The title track may be melodic and hummable, but the rest of it isn't. And it's very much a brave thing to do after Autobahn, because some of it isn't even consonant, some of it is just experimental, sounds on it. But there is a wistfulness to it, I think, and also there's also a certain humour that the actual album cover looks like a radio, and the whole thing has a concept. And they're honing, they're now getting that each album is about something modern but different. So you got an album about driving, and they got an album about radios and what's next to come. So there is that feeling that they're actually doing something else here. This band are just doing something totally different.
And just as Kraftwerk were now operating outside of any school or movement, the German scene itself had essentially disintegrated.
I think by the mid-70s, the idea of talking about this kind of, as it were, almost autonomous thing called krautrock is become less and less valid. I mean, the groups, some of the early groups had just fallen away by the wayside. They were just very much off their time. And then other groups have kind of gone on to forge, as it were, careers themselves, again, some sort of measure of international recognition. They've achieved what was probably the initial dream of getting the hell out of Germany. And each is a kind of recognisable entity going off in a different direction in their own right. I mean, groups like Neu are probably at the height of their powers in 1975 with A Music. I mean, although they were always a slightly combustible affair, Kraftwerk are very much kind of very much set out on the road. Can actually, or in fact, they'd only got sort of a couple more years left in them, although they were enjoying a sort of quite significant measure of success at that time. So yes, I think by that point it would be completely inappropriate to talk all the kind of krautrockers down and the whole krautrock scene, krautrocking together. It really wasn't like that.
Yet it was just at this point that the scene received its most emphatic endorsement. Both ex-Roxy Music member Brian Eno and the chameleonic pop icon David Bowie had been drawn to the distinctive sounds emerging from Germany, and that interest would in part lead them to begin working together in late 1976 on a series of albums that would bring this experimentalism to the mainstream.
In the mid-1970s and late 70s, both Eno and Brian and David Bowie came to a kind of crisis in their lives. Eno was making records in the UK that people weren't really interested in, and he wasn't getting much recognition, even though he was doing a lot of production work and working with a lot of other bands. He felt he needed to do something that would have a wider audience. David Bowie, for his part, was out of glam, was floundering in the US of A. He had made Young Americans and was then making Station to Station. At the time of Station to Station, he was basically drowning in a sea of drugs and decadence there, so he decided to move to Switzerland first. And there he met Eno, and it was, Eno came to see him, and the most important thing about that meeting was they both had similar listening tastes. They were both listening to Neu. They were both very fond of Rodelius and Mobius and that cluster thing. But also they were listening to Kraftwerk, and they felt that there was more happening in the German thing for new music, and new possibilities were opening much wider there than anywhere else in the world. So they decided that they would do something in 1977 in Germany.
Whereas Bowie was in part escaping from his excesses, Eno had already been making his mark in experimental music, and the move to Germany seemed like a natural progression. Having created the album No Pussyfooting with guitarist Robert Fripp in 1973, which incorporated tape delay techniques similar to those used by the Germans, he set up the Obscure Records label in '75 to release both his and other composers' experimental works. His albums Another Green World and Discreet Music both developed a sound that would eventually be labeled electronic ambient music, and this interest in new experimental forms brought him into contact with Cluster and their collaboration with ex-Kraftwerk guitarist Michael Rother, named Harmonia. Having lost Konrad Schnitzler and altered the spelling of their name in the early 70s, Cluster had persevered in their unique noise experiments through the first half of the decade. After moving to the rural village of Forst in 1973, they teamed up with Rother to record 2 albums as Harmonia, both of which introduced a more structured rhythmical and melodic element into the trademark Cluster sound. Drawn to the output of both ensembles, Eno traveled to Germany before Bowie, first to work with Harmonia and later with Cluster, and although initially he was looking to produce the bands, it soon became a more organic, collaborative process.
He found out that he can't produce Harmonia, neither Harmonia or Cluster, because it was not possible. He tried to do it. He tried to guide us in his direction, of course, because he's a great producer. But he always said, please stay in your way, do what you want to do. Don't listen to producers. Produce yourself, produce your music yourself. It's the best thing you can do, and you will be successful with it. And that's what I learned from him, especially for my solo music. We made our living because Cluster never came to break even with their products. And at sudden, with these 2 products with Brian, we got more attention, of course, and we got some money for it because they sold about 50,000 from each. That's a lot. At the time, it was a lot. I mean, not in 1 year, over 10, 15 years, but. And then By This River, this special song on his Before and After Science record, because he got this golden part. This song was used in films, and so we're still living from this music.
But where Cluster and Harmonia had been keen on collaboration, Kraftwerk were less forthcoming. Bowie had initially asked them to join him for his station-to-station tour as a support act, but they declined the offer. And although they were scheduled to record together, it never materialized. Nevertheless, released in January 1977, the first of Bowie and Eno's collaborations, Low, would bring experimental electronic music to a wider audience.
What's incredible about Low is the second side. I think the second side of Low is probably responsible for my sitting here. It's certainly responsible for an enormous amount of people starting to listen to experimental music. I would say without the second side of Low, the vast rock audience, the vast amount of people who are interested in rock music would never have heard Steve Reich, Terry Riley, or even some of this German electronica, because it was basically a portal, into all of this world. And it was such a brave thing to do, because it was basically extremely, it had this coldness to it as well, and this kind of, aridness to it, and it seemed to be devoid of something, and some of it was a deathly sound, but it was fascinating because it was such a brave thing to do. Tony Visconti produced Low, let's get this straight, and Eno was there, assisting and stuff. If Eno wasn't there, I don't think Bowie would have been able to get away with putting this on the second side, because Eno was there. It changed the whole dynamics of the thing. And it was it put him more in a kind of, in the same frame as Kraftwerk and those bands. It seemed to be the one trumpeting this music worldwide.
And with the release of the second of Bowie's trilogy later in 1977, the singer managed to capture the totally alien world of the divided Berlin. While in the UK, punk music laid waste to the dominant rock scene that had been becoming progressively overblown throughout the decade, with Heroes, not only did Bowie raise the profiles of the musicians of Germany, but also of lives outside of the typical Anglo-American experience. And this, in turn, would influence a new generation of musicians.
Bowie went to Berlin to hide. But of course, that German wall, you couldn't, a city divided by a wall, a city, not even a country. Actually, a city in the middle of an entire country you couldn't even go to. This is what's so weird, it's like an island. And then only half of that you could walk around, the Kurfürstendamm, etc. So I'm sure sitting in that flat, going out to get the milk and just being David Jones again for David Bowie was him being reborn. And there, that city, that Berlin city, even though an island in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by people who had nothing, rebuilding their lives, who can he relate to? Jump on a train, go to Dusseldorf, meet with Kraftwerk, yeah? These guys were also not pop stars, not going anywhere, but doing something brilliant. And again, that creativity, Bowie, Kraftwerk, Iggy, Hands Are By the Wall, the environment. Heroes as a song with Brian Eno's Tapestry background, with Carlos Alomar on that guitar. And then to do it in German, Ich bin dein König und du Königin. You know, wir können sie schlagen für alle Seiten. Dann singen wir Helden für einen Tag. I think just for one day, I mean, in that song, that song became now, for me, exactly what we were, i.e., we could be heroes for one night. We could dress up, get out of our grey, horrible, no future, Thatcherite Britain, and we could be somebody. We could look good. We could sit in that cafe. We could have a jeton. We could listen to beautiful music, and we could forget that really we've got to sign on tomorrow. We've got no job. We've got no future. Bowie's gone. Roxy has split up. We've got no heroes. The Sex Pistols have just said to everything, let's do it ourselves. Let's make our own music.
Certainly, the Eno Bowie thing was basically the green light for German musicians to really go for it, and they did in 1977 with Trans-Europe Express.
And it was with this album that Kraftwerk offered their creative input into what would become a classic year in electronic music. With a new concept and a still more technically accomplished sound, the German four-piece continued to tread their own unique path through the 70s. Yet this album was less anticipated than their last two records, simply because of the commercial disappointment of Radioactivity.
Of course, it's apparently, if you had a hit record, you need a follow-up. And this is true, I agree to that. You need a follow-up which could be played in the radio. Unfortunately, the single of Radioactivity wasn't a hit. It wasn't a hit worldwide, it became a hit in France. And that's why we played Friends. And I think that's where the idea of Trans-Europe Express came, really, from that angle. Being, of course, the first thing was the German identity, and then pretty much aware of the European identity, which includes, of course, all the other European nations. And this idea was really much coming up at that time.
It's a very European theme again, yeah? It is really something from the historical point where I thought, great, they are really able to find things which are not connected to Anglo-American or international or whatever, and still it is in a way very campy, and it is and it is the idea is like a film, yeah. You start in Paris, yeah. You go in a train and you end up in Düsseldorf, yeah. And I think that was the concept. Someone who is traveling through Europe, because at that time when Trans-Europa Express was released, I think it was perfectly planned with Kraftwerk. Everybody was discussing about the European Union. Yeah, that was a new thing.
Well, Trans-Europe Express has to be one of the greatest albums ever made. I mean, it's certainly it has one of the most beautiful records. I mean, some of it is so beautiful. It has this concept about trains. But then if you look at the album cover, it has four guys is the classic Kraftwerk of Florian Schneider, Ralph Hütter, and now Karl Bartos and Wolfgang Flür, who are doing percussion and other stuff in the background. All dressed in suits, looking wistfully in this kind of sepia cover, and then the writing is in this kind of Art Deco script. And then you took out the inner sleeve, and on the inner sleeve, which is printed, is this photograph of them sitting around a outdoors dinner table like you would see in most Hitler Youth films or whatever, of them in Bavaria having their tea. And you realise that this is a nostalgia for Germany that could have been, that never happened, but now hopefully can happen again, because they're dressed in 1930s clothes. But that's nothing compared to the music. You put on the music and there's this really thick motoric beat, and then these sounds over, and the whole record flows from beginning to end. It's not like there's a few interesting tracks and then there's a lot of experiment. There's no experiment on this. This is completely conceptual. The whole thing flows through.
I was not involved in the concept. The concept was done, but I think it was all of this was written very fast. I just remember during the night there was an engineer, Peter Bollig, at that time, and they went to a bridge, and they listened actually how a train would sound. Actually, I think it's not right how a train sound. A train sound, if you listen to the rhythm, it has to do with the wheels and with the track. When two pieces of track are getting together and you have two wheels, what you hear is a rhythm, da-dum, 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 da-dum. But this is a 3/4. But to come up with a danceable beat, you have to use four to the beat. So that's why I think it's just a metaphorical beat. It's not right though, but I think it's a damn good beat actually.
Champs-Élysées, leave Paris in the morning with TEE. Trans-Europe Express. Trans-Europe Express. Trans-Europe Express. Trans-Europe Express.
The two things that are very interesting about that, I think that Trans-Europe Express really is the beginning of the electro-bop movement in the UK, I think, because you can hear the same dunking and dishing kind of drum machine sound on that you hear then in the records of Depeche Mode, Gary Newman, Soft Cell, and all of those kind of bands in the UK. And the second thing about Trans-Europe Express, which is wonderful, is that it was recorded in 3 languages. It was recorded in French and English and German. So they were even recording, if they could have recorded the Japanese version, they would. These guys are not just able to make records, they're able to speak in different languages. These guys are not, this is the new Germany. The new Germans are international, they want the world to know, they want positive things, they want to give positive feelings and not go back to the past. So this was the most bizarre thing about TE. Basically, you had something futuristic wrapped in something old. It was the most bizarre record, and still it stands out as being a classic record. Definitely, I think, for me, my favorite record. Definitely, it's my #1 Kraftwerk record. There's a wonderful track about every person discovers themselves in the looking glass, and this Hall of Mirrors track, again, that harks back to the great stars of Hollywood, the Marlene Dietrich and Rita Hayworth. It harks back to that 1930s period.
Even the greatest stars discover themselves in the looking glass. Even the greatest stars discover themselves in the looking glass.
But also it also reflects, it's saying all the way to discover themselves in the looking glass, that also there's a slight reference there to Bowie, to the fact that Bowie was so transfixed with his image and would often be seen in films, particularly that the Cracked Actor film. Most of the film is him looking at himself in the looking glass, changing his image, doing his hair.
The artist is living in the mirror with the echoes of himself. Even the greatest stars live their lives in the looking glass. Even the greatest stars live their lives in the looking glass.
And of course, there's the absolute, the best thing on it is that we meet in the Champs-Élysées and we get the Trans-European Express, and maybe we'll meet Iggy Pop and David Bowie. This whole idea, or meet Iggy Pop, which they did. They're not only making conceptual records, but they're actually referencing their sources and doing it so well that even the sources come to meet them to congratulate them. So, I mean, the album is a triumph. I mean, it's one of the greatest records ever made. It's so influential.
And outside of Kraftwerk, electronic music was beginning to flourish like never before. The rising stars of a more commercial form, Vangelis and Jean-Michel Jarre, had already begun to break into the upper reaches of the charts with their anodyne electronic soundscapes. Yet it was with the arrival of Giorgio Moroder, an Italian producer working out of Munich, that a new era of electronic music would begin. On hearing his production work on the Donna Summer hit I Feel Love, Brian Eno declared that this was the sound of the future.
The instruments were getting easier to play. The instruments were getting smaller. They were getting more versatile, and they were better. I remember early synthesizers were huge and cumbersome. It had to be, they had to be programmed and everything with wires and patches, and you need to be basically an electronics engineer to work with them. Where now you were getting modular synthesizers with little keyboards and all sorts of keyboard things. Also, you had other people working in dance music that were hearing Kraftwerk and bands in Germany, the more like Neu and stuff, and feeling that this rhythmic thing could be really used in dance music. And Giorgio Moroder would have been influenced, and of course it was in Germany that he recorded all this stuff with Donna Summer. So of course, I Feel Love and stuff, these things were, it was a wonderful year for German music. Yeah, it was great, 1977.
Giorgio Moroder's influence, I think, is paramount in the whole concept of turning, what Kraftwerk were doing and taking it onto the dance floor. It's just this pounding sort of electronic beat that you got hold of, and the way that he sort of finds rhythms within that electronic track, and just keeps piling it on, and then overlays it with Donna Summer's sort of vocal. that make that track work. It's teaming the alien with the recognizable, you know, a very beautiful woman singing a very erotic song over this really extraordinary sort of robotic beat that's going on behind her.
And Kraftwerk themselves were fully aware of the flourishing world of disco.
At that time, we were going to the clubs frequently or regularly. I wouldn't say we were doing like pub crawling or club crawling, but you know, we were working in the evening, and then late at night at 12, 1 or even 2 o'clock, we were going to the clubs and we were listening to what was going on there. You had James Brown always in good clubs, like Sex Machine or Nature or all Papa Got a Brand New Bag, all these tracks which we liked very much because of this of the rhythm feel, of course. It was just a pictographical rhythm, just moving on with this groove forever. It was just what appeals to us very much.
Despite the band's interest in club music, Trans-Europe Express did not cross over into the mainstream and failed to chart in both the US and the UK. For all their technical mastery, Kraftwerk was still searching for a crossover hit to follow Autobahn.
It's interesting that Trans-Europe Express doesn't seem to make an enormous impact. Probably people had very much had their eye on like punk, new wave, and it was just a little ahead of its time. Only a little, but just a little ahead of its time at that point.
After we finished Trans-Europe Express, we went to Paris. We were going out at the mega disco at that time. I think it was a Palace Club or mega disco, thousands of people. And they put Trans-Europe Express on, and it wiped the dance floor completely. It wiped it empty. So again, Trans-Europe Express at that time was a really flop. Was a flop record.
Kraftwerk wouldn't have to wait long before their music was finally engaged by a worldwide audience. Electronic music had continued to develop through 1977, with the emergence of numerous post-punk bands who embraced the synthesizer, and the release of Throbbing Gristle's The Second Annual Report, the first notable industrial album. Bands such as New Yorkers Suicide and the British outfit Cabaret Voltaire were developing similar sounds. In 1978, the Yellow Magic Orchestra appeared with their self-titled debut, a pioneering Japanese outfit interested, like Kraftwerk, in a synthesis of electronics and pop music. They would prove a key influence for the movements yet to come. As a new electronic age was dawning, Kraftwerk returned to Kling Klang Studios for their next record. And having now kept their lineup constant for 2 albums, Schneider and Hutter invited Karl Bartos to become a creative member of the unit.
In the beginning, Ralph and Florian, they had this feeling of being part, I think, being part of an industry somehow, a cultural industry. And we were, Wolfgang and me, we were hired, called for some reason. We were studio musicians in the beginning, and later on, when I started being a composer and author on Man Machine, for me at least, it changed. Working together in the studio, and after 2 records, really, I was really invited to be part of the composer team because it came easy. I didn't have to prove anything. I proved it before, and so unfortunately, I was growing up to this easy pop music as well as on the classical background, so it really came easy. And the first thing I really composed on Man Machine was, I think it was a riff on Metropolis. Really, we were using at that time the sequencer, and Man Machine was the first record on which we could link the drums with the sequencer. So I didn't play the drums, it was played automatically by the drum machine. We came up with this, it was a Russian idea, we thought. It was somehow, it had to do with Metropolis, the movie. But when we first started improvising the tracks, at that time we did a lot of improvisations in the studio, we had this Russian feel. I think it captures the feel quite nicely from that. And then apparently robots, neon lights, and the model, yeah, really. So I think it was done in 6 weeks. Man Machine was recorded in 6 weeks using this fantastic new equipment. And it worked like clockwork, actually.
Released in May 1978, the Man Machine presented a new group image and more commercial content, and was a breakthrough for the band. With a controversial cover image referencing pre-war socialist and constructivist art, the album condensed the trademark Kraftwerk sound into even shorter tracks, and the notion of the band as music machines spread into their TV and live performances and photo shoots. The album went on to sell over 200,000 copies in France and charted for 13 weeks in the UK, where it peaked at number 9.
Man Machine, to me, has perhaps the most visually arresting Kraftwerk image, and it's the height of Kraftwerkers, provocateurs, posturing that kind of like rouge lipstick and those red shirts. I mean, the whole thing is derived as sort of constructivist homage, but synth pop is already beginning to sort of happen when that comes along, and nothing could be calculated, to offend, especially kind of American audience, people who believe in the authenticity of the guitar, the sincerity of the open-necked, sort of hairy-chested, macho rock hero, the Bruce Springsteen type, whatever, the Bee Gees type, all this kind of thing. I mean, it offends on every level. I mean, I think that's wonderful about that.
Here they were kind of more of a band. They were an identical kind of unit, in the same way that the Ohio-based Devo had dressed themselves up in yellow outfits and came on as a kind of an army in a way. Kraftwerk were a kind of more haute couture army. It is a very good gimmick for that time to just say, well, we're a machine. Kraftwerk is a kind of man machine, and this is what we do. You just turn us on and we'll turn you on. That is the basic simplicity of what they were trying to do at that time.
Wir laden unsere Batterie. Jetzt sind wir voller Energie. Wir sind die Roboter. Wir sind die Roboter. Wir sind die Roboter. Wir sind die Roboter.
It's where kind of Kraftwerk begin to detach themselves from the, as human beings really, from the concept. It's the beginning of the robotic kind of era of Kraftwerk. But Man Machine sold like 100,000 copies in the UK alone, charted and everything. And it had this wonderful song called The Model, which kept on charting. I think it got to number 1 in 91. I think Transubis then charted because of it. Then it was re-released again. It was an ad. It kept going and going. But by that stage, they were so consummate in their abilities to make fantastic pop music out of what they were doing, and it was so honed and precise, and the sheen, and it was like, it was almost like automatic music. They were just pumping this stuff. They were almost like they were basically the new Beatles.
She's a model and she's looking good. I'd like to take her home, that's understood. She plays hard to get, she smiles from time to time. It only takes a camera to change her mind.
that time on, more and more, we were pretty much aware we were working on the structure of a song. So I just remember me counting the verse, and now here we have to have a mid-eight, here we have to have a bridge, and it worked fantastic. And I just remember talking about structure and whistling. We thought we missed a hit on Model because we haven't had a refrain. There's no chorus. So it's just a good structure, but there's no chorus summing it all up. It's just a guy telling a story about how he wants to pull a model, something. But we always were quite sure we missed the refrain, we missed the chorus. But somehow it worked.
I saw her on the cover of a magazine. Now she's a big success, I want to meet her again.
They'd retained the sounds that they had, say, on Trans-Europe Express, but they had sharpened it as well and sort of made it more sort of accessible in a way. They'd figured out the way of compressing it in a way, compacting it. It would be a better way to explain it. From a 12-inch size record into a 7-inch size record, into a song that lasted not 20 minutes, but a song that lasted 3 minutes. They'd managed to compact all that energy, all that sort of newness, all that kind of strangeness as well. There's a very strange, still weird kind of feel about it. Again, you see showroom dummies and things like that in the window, and that's the kind of you're not talking about a model as such that walking up and down the catwalk. You're talking more like a model in a shop window that's just about to have a expensive fur coat draped over its shoulders, but it'll just stand there in the same position. But it's kind of alien but beautiful in a way.
Yet, despite its phenomenal success, Man Machine divided some of its listeners. Although it was pivotal in bringing Kraftwerk to a larger audience, the more commercial elements were off-putting to many of their earlier fans, while some critics felt that the conceptual rigour that had been applied to Autobahn, Radioactivity and Trans-Europe Express had here been diluted somehow.
It is the classical pop album done by Kraftwerk. And of course, it's not everybody's taste, yeah? A lot of fans, I think, I never really felt that Kraftwerk is a pop group. Felt a bit disappointed, yeah. I thought they sold out, yeah. Nice cover, yeah, interesting image, a little bit Russia, a little bit, communism, a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of robots and a little bit of Schaufensterpuppen and models, and it's just a pop album.
I don't think it works as well as Trans-Europe Express. I think, conceptually, I think Man Machine is more a collection of great songs. Man Machine, I think it's probably in terms of a pop record, a better collection of songs, because there's songs like The Model and some that are extremely well put together. They're almost like a Beatles song or a Burt Bacharach song. It's fantastic. The other side of it is that as a concept, the Man Machine does not hold together. It's not from beginning to end a perfect conceptual record where a Trans-Europe Express conjured up in the 1930s, traveling, say, on the Orient Express, meeting kind of film stars like Marlene Dietrich on the train, people in wonderful private carriages with mirrors and stuff, looking out at the countryside, going from one side of Europe to the other. Yes, it was from beginning to end. It was a complete journey. Where the Man Machine, no, the Man Machine it has a concept, but it's a looser one.
Yet the album was key to the dawning of a new electronic era. In the UK, a new generation of musicians obsessed with the sounds of Berlin-era Bowie and Kraftwerk emerged. And in 1979, the seeds of the synth-pop era were sown by a young DJ called Rusty Egan, who recognized the dance floor potential of this music.
I would think Autobahn was probably my first introduction to electronic music. My interest was the length, the fact that it was like 15 minutes long and it kept stopping and starting. And I mean, what is it? It's got nothing on it. It's just the road. It just goes on and on and on. So to create that beautiful do 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 do, you know, to create that monotonism. In a way, they call it trance today, you know. And for me to then say, well, how can I play that in a bar, you know?
The bar in question was London's Blitz Club, where Egan's electronic nights flourished. A new culture was emerging, and as Bowie released his Scary Monsters album with its more commercial electronic sound, young acts making prominent use of the synthesizer sprung up across the country. And the hub of this activity was the Blitz, where this new music was played alongside Kraftwerk and their fellow electronic pioneers.
As the DJ in the club and playing records not made for DJs, don't forget these people, Kraftwerk, Klaus Schulze, whoever, were making their music unbeknownst that there was a bar or club somewhere that was going to play it. They weren't making music to be played in bars and clubs. They were making their music. Kraftwerk were being, you know, dimension machines. They were being robots. Nobody was saying, hey, this is going to be the new electronic dance music. Nobody said anything like that. So they were just making their music. And, you know, Simple Minds in Scotland were making Life in a Day. Talk, you know, they were making great music. Lots of people were making great music using synthesizers. And you've got Soft Cell in Leeds, and you've got Depeche Mode in Essex. Everyone can get hold of a synthesizer. What they were actually doing with it...
Pretty much aware of the fact that the groups coming from England, all of them, they brought something new into this electronic sound, which wasn't there before. They brought their heritage. They brought back the Beatles, and they brought back all this English pop music. But now they weren't using guitars, they were using sequencers. And I thought, okay, that's fair enough. They bring something into it again.
Alongside the Human League, Ultravox and Depeche Mode, a more abrasive set of groups appeared who had emerged from the punk scene and were using synthesizers within a punk aesthetic. Like their more commercial counterparts, bands on newly formed independent labels such as Cabaret Voltaire, Joy Division and Soft Cell were all equally influenced by Kraftwerk.
Those kind of groups, like Joy Division, like a Dirty Column, like a lot of factory bands, or bands on Mute, or other, what we call Gang of Four, those kind of bands, Cabaret Voltaire, all of those bands in the UK, those what we call left field enemy bands at the time, they would have had every Kraftwerk record in their collection. Certainly, they're the kind of people who often cited Kraftwerk, who would be a massive fan, particularly Cabaret Voltaire. Really obsessed with Kraftwerk.
When I was in Leeds, the punk thing was still big and happening, and it was like okay, so you can play 3 chords on a guitar. Well, what I thought, I could play 1 note on a synth, and so it was kind of like a progression. It was just like a zeitgeist, really. There was like the Human League, and there was Cabaret Voltaire and stuff. And there was us, and we were just like, our initial songs, we were writing them in this little crummy little studio in art college about sort of Tupperware parties and just rubbish and about shit biscuits. And just basically about the state of society, which I think is still relevant today, quite honestly. And that it was that kind of, that was like electronic punk. I think that's what we were doing. We weren't trying to be pop stars. We weren't being Spandau Ballet or Duran Duran. I mean, I saw some Duran Duran recent stuff, and they're trying to be Kraftwerk. It's like,
I mean, you know, God bless them, you know, but they're not Kraftwerk. But I mean, we were punks, basically. We were just punks with synths. When I was a kid, I was probably about 13, and I heard stupid records on the radio, because I used to love the radio, Radio 1 at the time. Things like Popcorn by Hot Butter, which is a really silly record. Beep, 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 boop, beep, beep, boop. And the other one was Son of My Father by Chicory Tip, which I later discovered was written by Giorgio Moroder. I was just kind of, it's like, what's that new sound? When I heard Autobahn, I thought, I want that sound. But then I was listening to kind of soul music, and so to me it was like a sort of like Kraftwerk, Northern Soul, kind of bang. And that's really how Tainted Love happened.
Sometimes I feel I've got to run away, I've got to get away from the pain you drive into the heart of me, the love we share.
And obviously working with someone like Mark Arman, who's such a passionate singer, brilliant lyricist and passionate singer. And I was into synthesizers, and that's what brought it about, really.
But where certain bands like Soft Cell were taking the sounds pioneered by Kraftwerk and moving into new areas, others were more obvious in their approach. With his trilogy of records beginning with 1979's Replicas, Gary Newman not only showed that he was influenced by the sound of Kraftwerk, but also mimicked their man-machine image.
I thought it was fair enough if they bring their Liverpool and London heritage into synthesizer music. Like the Human League did, Don't You Want Me, Baby. This is great, and this is perfect because it's a combination. They used apparently the synthesizer sound, which we didn't come up with actually. Somebody else did. We only put something together probably, and we invented a statement. And I thought, at that time, I think it's fair enough if they bring together, if they make a collage of synthesizer, sound, electronic drums, and their English pop music. It works fine, and it's cool. But if you start wearing red ties, red shirts and black ties, and look grim in the camera and make photos like this, it's just a parody.
Gary Newman was a rock star, no matter how he wished to cast himself. And every time he came on and did Cars or something, you weren't thinking, wow, Cars. You were thinking Gary Newman. Whereas when Kraftwerk came on and did The Model, you thought The Model, because you had nothing to really identify with that song. With Gary Newman, you knew there was this rather portly bloke with makeup on, sort of making funny sweeping gestures and singing about cars in this sort of balladian kind of way, you know what I mean? But with Kraftwerk, who knows what they were really like? You know, they were robots. In a way, definitely, they were the precursor to the dance music scene from, acid house, where you didn't all you had, the stars there were a DJ who you couldn't really identify either. It was a man who put records on and mixed records and manipulated sounds to create a sound that was the whole thing. That was what you were interested in. You were interested in being taken over by the sound, as opposed to gawping at the individual making the sound. And I think that's what they pioneered, really.
And it was into this musical world that they had so clearly influenced that Kraftwerk released the follow-up to Man Machine. Issued in May 1981, Computer World was a return to the band's more coherent conceptual approach, and the album made the UK top 20 and remained on the charts for 22 weeks. In December, a double A-side release of the album's title track and The Model took Kraftwerk to #1 in the UK singles charts, and it was clear that the times had finally caught up with the band.
With the Man Machine, I felt that for the first time they seemed to be just slightly behind the times, if anything. But with Computer World, they're back at the forefront, they're back at the vanguard. And I mean, one of the biographers of Kraftwerk has written that if IBM in 1980-81 had kind of had embraced computers as in the way that Kraftwerk did, thematically on that album, they'd have been even in a much healthier situation 10 years down the line, because they didn't. Kraftwerk were absolutely spot on that album, and not just about something that's just beginning to come in, but about the fact that anticipating the sort of the digital swarm of the kind of 21st century that you sort of see, which is the sound, it's that album, that kind of very punctualistic pinpoint, track like Numbers. They really are, they're looking a long way down the line.
I'm the operator with my pocket calculator. I'm the operator with my pocket calculator.
There's something else going on with Computer World that I think is, again, coming back to this provocation, this teasing of Rock's kind of self-image and pretensions. And it's that they use the pocket calculators and the idea that music can just be made on pocket calculators. They constantly use the word little, and Ralph Wood is constantly using the word little. He said, machines is just little. I think that especially with men and the synthesizers, quite often use like great banks of synthesizers and playing two at a time, and the bigness of it has some sort of like phallic significance a lot of the time. Musicians are saying, no, you can just make the same things with just little, and constantly teasing using the word little all the time, and the kind of like the climax of the show where they come out and they just, that didn't, you could have made music like that, but nobody wanted to, because nobody that's, people, want, Kraftwerk like sort of strike a pose, but they're making poses with a point. The fact is that especially sort of male sound makers didn't really feel comfortable playing something that little.
I'm controlling and composing by pressing down a special key and plays a little melody. By pressing down a special key and plays a little melody.
Kraftwerk really kind of were looking into a long future here, where they were looking at the embryonic beginnings, of home computers were starting off in the early 1980s. Still quite expensive, available to the few, not the many, but I mean, Kraftwerk were clever enough to be able to see that the future would be computers, and the future would dominate for a very long time, and they made an album, a concept album around it. But as many people say, it's their last great concept album. Well, they had Tour de France and stuff, but I mean, it's not a strong concept as Computer World. We get into that era of Kraftwerk where they really don't want anymore to be seen by anybody, where they have mannequins and robots. The records would come out, but that was it. And there was not really a feeling that people were wondering, is there anybody there anymore? But I mean, they still got enormous respect from the media. And enormous respect from the public. The album charted. But at this stage, it's fair to say that there were so many other groups making good and great electronic music around them that the future had at last caught up with them. They weren't any more ahead of their time in terms of their sound, in terms of what they were doing. They were just part of a general, I won't say morass, but a general group of people who were making music with electronic instruments.
Just ain't walk.
And as Kraftwerk receded from the public eye, electronic music continued to evolve. Their influence was not only heard through the samples used on Afrika Bambaata's landmark Planet Rock record, but even in the music of singer-songwriter Neil Young, who openly confessed his debt to them on his 1982 album Trans. And as the 80s progressed, new forms of electronic music continued to emerge, such as house and techno, which also clearly owed a debt to the pioneering work of the German four-piece. Yet Kraftwerk themselves were mysteriously absent from this electronic revolution, with only one more album released before the close of the decade. When they were a lone force, they thrived, but once part of a larger musical landscape, Kraftwerk drifted away from the limelight.
Still all these British synthie pop, new electronic pop, new romantic and so on, that I think, well, it referred aesthetically to Kraftwerk, but that was very much about individual people, and in a way it was not really competing with them. Early electronic hip hop was much more. The ideas of being robots, not being authors, but being there, working under a pseudonym. This was really a competition, and they didn't have an answer for that because that was now it was no longer for people in some Düsseldorf studio who were always pretending to thinking seriously about every beat, but now it was an entire movement. In the US, and it was anonymous, it was mechanical, it was about death of the author, if you wish. The connection from these electric boogie, electric hip hop to early house, or to early Detroit and Chicago. They were very big in that. They were always mentioned honorably there, but that was, of course, such a big thing that they were not. They could not respond to it any other way than becoming the senior, the elder statesman. That's the only possible role that was there for them after that, and they haven't done anything else but that. You know, that's it.
And as elder statesmen, the group still remain reclusive and detached from popular music. In the new millennium, their musical activities have notably increased, their infrequent live shows continuing to draw huge audiences, and their 2003 album Tour de France soundtracks receiving warm reviews. Yet as pioneers of electronic music, their time has perhaps passed, and the baton has been handed to a whole slew of significant acts who would not exist if it weren't for the revolutionary music of Kraftwerk.
Conceptually, maybe they had run out of ideas. Maybe this is possible, or else they just weren't. I mean, it was very hard to know. They had done, remember they were making a record a year from 1969, so 69, 70, 71, 72, 73, 74. There's always a new record coming out. And you know, that's the kind of work rate. And there's so many brilliant records, you can't keep it up. You know, it's not possible. Nobody has kept it up, even the Beatles. So, I mean, you know, I know at the end of the day, Kraftwerk are human beings making music, and they have to admit that they are human, and they actually did show human failings as well. So, but what a legacy to leave behind you, you know.